So if controls don't define their own look, how does anything ever appear? Don't we end up in an infinite regress? You might think that the rectangle control's appearance would come from its template, but that in turn would contain a rectangle control which would look for its appearance in its template, and so on. But in fact we don't hit this problem, because most elements are not controls. The only types that derive from the control base class are the types that have some sort of specific interactive behaviour, things like button, listbox, tree view, scroll bar, text box, and so on. These are all controls. But rectangle, ellipse, image, these don't derive from control. They're more primitive and derive from a lower level type called framework element, which itself is the base of the control class. In fact, it's the base of almost anything in the UI tree. Only classes that derive from control have a template, because it's the control class that introduces the template property. The types that define the appearance, the things that populate the visual tree of the stuff you can see, these are all more primitive and do not have templates of their own. By the way, the terminology gets a bit confused here. A lot of WPF authors use the term control somewhat approximately. They use it often to mean any visual element, including things that don't actually derive from control. And in some way this is reasonable enough. The namespace system.windows.controls contains lots of things that do not derive from control. But I think this is a bit confusing. So for clarity, when I say control, I mean very specifically something that derives from the control class, and I use the more general term element to mean something in the visual tree that may or may not be a control. And here I'm inventing the term primitive element to mean an element that provides its own intrinsic appearance. You could think of these things as lookful elements as opposed to lookless controls. Now there's a gotcha to be aware of on this slide. Text box is a control. It provides an editable text field. Now people new to WPF often get this confused with text block. Text block is not a control. It's a primitive used to render text. So text block has no intrinsic interactive behavior of its own. You can't edit a text block. And in general, primitive elements have no intrinsic interactive behavior. You as the application developer have the power to make them interactive. You can attach event handlers to primitive elements to make them do things, but you have to do all the work. Controls, by contrast, usually have intrinsic interactive behavior of their own. You don't need to do anything to make a text box editable, for example. It just is.